All right, and it's 11 o'clock here in Singapore, so we're going to go ahead and get this started. I know we've got some other people planning to join us today, a small group at the moment, but hopefully those other folks will join in as they've registered. So hello, good morning if you're here in Asia, good afternoon in some parts of Australia, good evening if you're in North or South America, and of course if you're in Europe, you should probably be asleep right now. My name is Dr. William Thomas. I am a leadership coach based here in Singapore, and I'm very happy that you could join in on today's session. This is our first time using Zoom for these monthly webinars, so I'm kind of keeping my fingers crossed that everything's going to work out okay. You may have noticed I've got everybody's mics muted at the moment. That's just to avoid any extra background noise. But as we're going on, if you have questions, I do encourage you to unmute and come on up on the microphone and ask your question. And of course, you can also ask questions as we go along using the chat box down there. I've also got everybody's video turned off just to avoid any extra bandwidth issues or any extra distractions. What I want you to be able to focus on would be the material that I'm going to share with you today, but also any ideas that you want to share with each other as we're going along. We're going to be talking today about a topic that I think is going to take on even more importance in the months to come. And that, of course, is aligning your company's strategy with your company's organizational culture, making sure that the two don't conflict with each other. Now, I say this is going to take on more importance because as we emerge from the pandemic crisis in these coming months, we're going to need a strategy to recover from the economic damage that it's caused and a strategy to take advantage of the new environment that we're going to be working in. I know that my own business strategy is undergoing significant changes. I imagine that's true for many of you as well. You can also expect that a lot of your companies may have experienced a change in your organizational culture in the last few months. As the way that you work has changed fairly dramatically, you may find that your company's culture has changed as a result. So while you might think you understand your company's culture, realize that if that understanding is based on the way things used to be, then it may be a little bit out of date. And we're going to talk a bit today about understanding your culture. So our session is scheduled for 45 minutes, as always, with these monthly webinars. I've got about 35 minutes of material to share with you, and then we've got some time for Q&A. Now you can type questions, as I said, into the chat box at any time, and I should see those. I may take some of those as we go along. I may save some of them for the end. It just depends on the question. And of course, if you see somebody else's question pop up there, I encourage you, if you have some thoughts on that, to go ahead and consider answering that yourself. I think it's really great when we've got people sharing ideas, not just from one to many, but from amongst the folks who are participating. So please do share your ideas with each other. Now, before we start talking about culture and strategy, I really would like to explain where the title of this webinar came from. So there was a fellow named Peter Drucker, who was a very well-known management professor in the mid 20th century. And he's responsible for a lot of our thinking about management and leadership today. Incidentally, he also created one of the first executive MBA programs. So if you've done an executive MBA, you can either thank Peter Drucker or you can curse his name. I guess it depends on how you felt about the program. There is a quote that is often attributed to Peter Drucker, and it is that culture eats strategy for breakfast. Now, in reality, nobody knows for sure if he actually said that. It doesn't appear in any of his books or any of his papers, but it does sound like the kind of thing that he would have said because it's true. And we'll talk about why that is. Now, the phrase culture eats strategy for breakfast is a bit of an Americanism. So as an American, let me try and explain what that means in case that's not really clear. The idea of eating something for breakfast is all about dominating something. It's all about like taking control of something. Now, as a runner, I might say that a friend of mine, like my friend Andrew, eats marathons for breakfast, you know, meaning he can go out and run a marathon without it being a big challenge. He's tougher than that 42-kilometer race is. Drucker's quote expresses the same kind of idea, that organizational culture is a stronger force than organizational strategy. If the two are in conflict with each other, the culture is what will determine how people work, not so much the strategy. And so that means that if you have a business strategy for recovering from this pandemic, the plans you're making may not be followed by your employees if the culture doesn't support them. You may not be able to achieve what you want to achieve if the culture doesn't support that strategy. And we're going to talk about why that is and what you can do about it. But let me share with you an example to show you what I mean. So this is a story of the merger between United Airlines and Continental Airlines. And the fact that the two planes are flying in opposite directions in this picture is not accidental. While United did create a strategy for buying Continental and absorbing it, the cultures of the two airlines were really flying in opposite directions. Now, United bought Continental back in 2011, but things did not quite go as planned. You know, when one airline buys another, there are a lot of business processes that need to be combined. And that's what United focused on. They focused on the business processes. So everything from reservation systems to aircraft maintenance, to frequent flyer programs, to employee compensation and seniority, all of that had to be merged. And they made plans for that. What they ignored, though, were the cultural differences between United and Continental. Now, when I lived in the US at that time, I was a regular flyer on both of these airlines. And my experience was that United had a very customer-focused culture, while Continental had a more employee-focused culture. And their idea was that happy employees would take good care of their customers. I didn't always find that to be the case, but that was their idea. Now, this applied to all their customer-facing people, not just flight attendants, but also reservation agents and ticket counter people. And honestly, the difference between the two was pretty obvious to passengers. Now, when they merged, these two cultures clashed, and it created confused employees, which led to poor service. In many cases, the Continental culture started to become the dominant one, even though it was United that had bought Continental. Despite having a very clear business strategy that would have people doing things the United way, the culture did not really support that. Now, I can remember flying after the merger and being able to tell if a flight attendant had been part of United before the merger or part of Continental. I mean, it was that obvious. And as a result of these cultural clashes and this very confused culture that did not support their business strategy, they had trouble meeting their business goals. So the year after the merger, 43% of all US airline complaints were about United. Probably not too big of a surprise. The first year is going to be transitional. It's going to be a little rough. But by 2015, United was still ranked last of all of the large US airlines in the J.D. Power and Associates Customer Satisfaction Survey. And in 2012, as well as later in 2014, when other US airlines were making record profits in some cases, United was losing money. And you don't buy another airline so that you can lose money. So I guarantee you this was not their goal. They weren't making their goals. Their strategy laid out a path to business success, but a confused culture threw them off their game. Now, we want to help you avoid that by having a strategy that is supported by your culture. So here's the return on investment that I want you to get out of today. First of all, by the time we're done here, you should be able to explain the relationship between strategy and culture to someone else. I mean, if you can explain it to someone else, that means you probably understand it pretty well yourself, right? Next, you should be able to at least start drafting a strategy that aligns with your organizational culture and makes use of that culture. Now, today's webinar is not about how to write a strategy. Okay, that's a whole workshop in itself. But today's program will help you get started, and it will help make sure that you're asking the right questions as you start developing that strategy. Finally, we're going to take a look at where you can make changes to your culture. Now, an organizational culture can sort of just happen with nobody trying to create it. But when that's the case, it may be a very confused culture. It may not be what you want. To get the culture that you want, to get a strong culture that supports your company, leaders need to be a bit more proactive about that and try to create the culture that they want. And we're going to talk about some ideas for doing that, some very specific ideas for doing that. Let me point out that as we talk about creating strategies and changing cultures, you don't have to be at the top of the company to have an impact on that. Looking back on my own background, I've got a PhD that focuses on organizational culture. I've spent 21 years in the US military as a strategist, so I've seen this from both the culture side and the strategy side. And I can tell you that relationship matters at all levels of the organization. So whether you could be the CEO planning where your company's going to go, or you could be the head of managing a 3-person team that has to help carry out that strategy. But if you're making plans for how people are going to work, then you need to make sure that those plans line up with the culture in which those people work. So like I said, whether you're the CEO, whether you're a functional manager, whether you're a business unit head, or whether you're a first-time supervisor, I think you're going to find that this is going to be valuable. So let's start by considering the relationship between strategy and culture. We're going to start by making sure we're all talking about the same thing by defining what we mean by organizational culture. And then we'll talk about why it matters and how it affects how people work. And finally, we'll discuss why culture eats strategy for breakfast. Now, organizational culture is a term that gets used a lot, but it doesn't get explained a lot. So let's start by fixing that. Organizational culture, at its most basic definition, comes from a professor named Edgar Schein, who's considered by many to be the person who really understands this topic the best. And Professor Schein defines organizational culture as a pattern of shared basic assumptions that everybody in the organization understands. Now, these assumptions, they are the foundation, they're the basis for all the beliefs about the company that everybody in the company has. And these assumptions represent the priorities and the values and the expected behaviors that are commonly understood throughout the organization. What we think of as culture is essentially a common set of beliefs within the organization, things you might not even think about consciously, but deep down inside, you know them. That culture gets expressed in different ways, and you see that in Schein's model of culture over there on the right side of the screen. You have the basic assumptions, the things you might not even think about. And these assumptions encourage people to create values and priorities that guide their actions. So what's important to this company? How should we function in this company? How should we work? What are the expectations? You know, these are largely invisible, though you can see expressions of that culture ultimately in different ways, what Schein refers to as artifacts and creations. Let me give you a simple example of this, just to make it to make this kind of theoretical idea seem really, really obvious. The military offers a very simple example of culture, a very simple way to describe culture. So a basic assumption might be that being in the military is dangerous. And I think we all would probably have that assumption, even if you're not in the military. But that is a basic assumption that being in the military is dangerous. And so a value that emerges from that is that we will all work together as a team to support each other in that dangerous environment. And an artifact of that culture, something tangible, something we can see, is that we all wear the same uniform to represent that we are all on the same team, helping each other through those dangerous situations. Now, this is a very basic example, and I use the military because a military uniform is a very visual artifact, and it's one that we're all familiar with. But think about how this could play out in the private sector. Think about Netflix, for example, the company. Not what you're watching tonight, okay, but the actual corporation behind it. They may have a basic assumption that says, we only hire the best people. And everybody understands that they were hired because they're the best. So a value that emerges from that could be that the best people can be trusted to do what's right, so they don't need to be micromanaged. So if we're hiring the best people, we should be able to trust those people. And an artifact of that then could be Netflix's famous vacation policy, which allows people an unlimited number of vacation days, just as long as they do their work well. As long as they get their work done, there's no limit on how many vacation days they can take in a year. That is an artifact representing the basic assumptions and the values and the beliefs inherent within Netflix, that we hire the best people and we trust them. So culture isn't just the behaviors that you see, it's all the ideas behind those behaviors. So how do those affect how people work? Well, the culture shapes employee expectations about how they're supposed to be working and what they can expect from others. People learn, for example, whether they should be risk takers or risk averse. They learn if they should be competing with their colleagues or collaborating with them, whether they can talk to people in other functions directly or whether they have to go up to their manager and over to that function and down to that other person. Now, this isn't always written down. A lot of times it's just known, and you kind of pick it up as you go along. But these expectations are formed, and people work based on these expectations. And that's the thing, you know, when people come to work every day, they have a sense of what is expected of them. So if the assumption is that you're supposed to be risk averse and not take a lot of chances on new things, then people are not going to be innovative because they're not going to try new things. That's the expectation, is that you don't take chances. If the expectation is that my colleagues and I are all competing against each other, then when I come to work, I don't go out of my way to help them. And I may not let them know that I'm having a problem. I may not reach out to them for help because I don't want to let my competition know that I'm having issues. So these expectations drive how we're going to work day to day. We work the way the culture tells us we're expected to work. The culture, by the way, also affects who you hire and even how you hire them. For example, if people are going to work independently, then you might feel more comfortable using a recruiting agency to help you hire. Whereas if you expect them to be more collaborative and everyone's in a tight-knit team, you might keep most of your recruiting in-house because how somebody interacts with everybody becomes really, really important. The qualities you look for in a candidate are going to change based on the culture. If you're looking for somebody who can work just individually, maybe you hire somebody with the best technical skills. If you're looking for someone who can be collaborative, maybe you look for someone with strong team leadership skills, even if they aren't the most technically proficient. It's the difference between hiring a rock star and hiring a member of a K-pop band, okay? They're two different things. And again, the culture is going to determine who you hire. It affects everything you do. And because culture affects everything you do, it can end up being stronger than any strategy that you develop. Now, why is that? Why does culture tend to be stronger than strategy? Well, frankly, it's because people pay attention to the things that are going to affect them. If they feel that taking a chance on something new and failing at it is going to cost them a promotion, then they're not going to take a chance on something new and take a risk of failing. If the culture says you have to always be successful in order to get promoted, people will do what it takes to be successful in order to get promoted, even if that's not the right thing for the company, even if it's not the thing that fits the strategy. Think of it this way. Strategy is what the bosses talk about. Strategy is what the bosses say, but culture is what people believe to be real. And what people believe is going to affect them, and what people believe is expected of them is what's really going to matter to them. That perception that they have becomes the reality. And very often that perception comes about, those beliefs come about because of the actions that take place in the office. Your boss can say one thing and then do something else, and frankly, you're going to pay more attention to what they actually do. So, you know, you can give people coffee mugs that say innovation. Everybody in the company can have one of these coffee mugs. But then if they try something new and they get in trouble and they get the boss screaming at them, they're going to learn very quickly not to try new things. And if they aren't trying new things, then they aren't being innovative. All the coffee mugs in the world cannot overcome a screaming boss. or a lost promotion or a reduced bonus. People are going to pay attention to what you actually do far more than what you actually say, okay? It's the actions that matter a lot more than words, and actions are what shape the culture. And that's why culture ends up being so much more powerful than the strategy. So when you create your strategy, you need to understand your culture and you need to take that into consideration. Now, before we move on to understanding your culture and using that to help build your strategy, let me pull up and see if there are any questions. If anyone has any questions at this point, you can type them into the chat box, or you can just come up on your microphone and ask away. Any questions so far? Okay, all right. Well then, let's take a look then at how you can create a strategy in a way that matches up with your culture. So the 3 points we're going to talk about are, first of all, the basic questions when defining your strategy, where you want to go and where you are now. Then we're going to look at describing your culture, defining it, articulating it, making sure you understand it and can explain it to somebody else. And then lastly, matching your strategy up with those cultural factors. So when we talk about creating your strategy, you got to understand where you want to go, but also where you are now. So you need to understand your finish line. What is the finish line? What are our goals? What does it look like? Where is that finish line? How do we define it? How do we define success? And most folks will do this when they're laying out a strategy. Now, the step that unfortunately a lot of people miss is figuring out where they are now. What is your starting line? Where are you today? Because the starting line can look a lot different from the finish line. In fact, it should, you know. And then when you've got that understanding, then start to look at how you get from here to there. How do you get from today's starting line to the future's finish line? How do you get to your goals? And what are the opportunities that will help you along the way? And what are the challenges that you're going to face trying to get to your goals? So draft this out, start with this process, okay? Start, and like I said, this is not a whole how to make a strategy session, okay? That's a half day, a full day workshop in itself. But these are the basics of developing a strategy. And while you're doing that, or immediately after you do the basics here, make sure you understand your culture. Take a look at all of your policies and your processes. Put aside for the moment all the coffee mugs and the posters on the wall and the rah-rah speeches in the town halls, and look at your actual policies and your processes and ask yourself, what kind of behaviors does this create? What kind of behaviors do these emphasize? So for example, if your performance reviews are all about individual success, people are going to focus on individual success, no matter how often you say collaboration. If your awards for your sales teams are based only on the numbers, then people are going to do what they know works. They're not going to try anything new. They're not going to be innovative. They're going to go with what has been proven to work rather than taking a chance on something new, because, hey, you don't reward people for trying something new. So look at all your policies and processes and be honest with yourself about what kind of behaviors this is going to create. And also spend some time observing people, observing how they interact, how they work. You know, if you're telling yourself we're a collaborative company, but everybody is hunkered down in their cubicles, not talking to each other, well, these days, obviously not in their cubicles, but at home, if nobody's communicating effectively, then you're not actually a collaborative company. So observe how people work, okay? And then try just asking them. And most companies will do things like a climate survey or engagement surveys, and those are great. You may not have a lot of time for that, but at least, you know, especially if you're running a small team instead of running a whole company, maybe just sit down and have a coffee chat sometime with your folks. Get a sense from them about what they're thinking and what their expectations are and what their perceptions are. And you might find that they're very different from what you think they are. So spend some time articulating that culture, describing and defining that culture so that you make sure you really understand it. And then, as you're developing your strategy, match it up against your culture and see where the connections are and where the gaps might be. So lay out your strategy. For example, in this case, let's say we want to increase profit by 10% next year over where we were this year. Okay, very simple goal. We know where we are now, and we know we want to go 10% beyond that. So what are the things that we're going to look to do? Well, we see an opportunity to create new products in our existing markets. That's a chance to grow our sales and grow our revenue. We could begin selling in new regions, so another opportunity to increase revenue. We could use new technologies to improve efficiency and cut costs. Okay, so there's another challenge is cost cutting. So we're going to find a way around that. So that's our very basic strategy. And now let's look at our culture. And in our culture, we're early adopters of new technology. We value diversity in the workforce. We encourage continuous learning. We reward risk-taking. We see failure as an opportunity to learn rather than as a bad thing. And you see where the strategy and the culture match up. So as you're trying to create new products for existing markets, well, you're a risk-taking company, so taking a chance on a new product is something you're likely to do. You want to begin selling in new regions. It's a good thing that you're a diverse company with multiple viewpoints, people from multiple backgrounds, different ethnicities, different languages, and so forth. Cutting costs with new technologies. Hey, we're the people that are standing in line for 3 days outside the Apple store when a new iPhone is coming out, okay? So in this case, a strategy that we've started to lay out seems to match up with our culture. And that's a good thing, okay? We can actually see the connections here. But what if our culture is different? So what if we don't like new technology? What if we're very risk averse? Well, it's going to be hard to create new products for our existing market if we are risk averse. Because it's hard to be innovative if you can't take chances on something new. It's hard to be innovative if you're afraid of failure. So right away, we're going to have trouble creating something new. What we're probably going to do is just add some tweaks to something that already exists, and that's not the same thing. We want to use technologies to improve efficiency. Well, we're a company where we still print out every email and file it away in a filing cabinet. And you laugh, but I've known people who do that in my career, not that long ago, actually. So we're going to have trouble using new technologies because we are afraid of technologies. Now, the one thing that's in our favor is that we are a diverse company. And so as we look at new regions, at least we have some of those different backgrounds to help us. But all in all, we've got some gaps here. We're going to have some problems here. Now, once you see where the gaps are, once you see where those red lines are, you can either go back and adjust your strategy. That is certainly one option, or consider trying to change your culture. And in a moment, we're going to take a look at how to do that. But let me once again pull up here and see if there are any questions about this, about the basics of coming up with a strategy that lines up with your culture. Any questions at this point? Again, either in the chat box or just come up on the microphone and let me know. Any questions? All right. All right. Well, let me go ahead then and take us forward. Now, I said earlier that a culture can kind of just happen if nobody tries to shape it proactively. But if that's the case, you often get a culture that's kind of weak and may not be what you need. So in order for your culture to help you get the kind of performance you want, you may need to create the right culture. And on this slide, this is a very basic model of creating a culture. Now, this is a model that I've been using for the last 20 years, ever since I used it in my PhD dissertation. And I've used it in different settings ever since, in the military and in the private sector and in academia. I've used it in the United States. I've used it around Southeast Asia. I've used it up in Hong Kong. This model works. This model works very well. And what it's telling us is that culture is the result of other things. Culture comes last. The culture emerges because of other things that you've done. And we've talked a bit about the strategy. What I want us to focus on here is the structure. The key to making your culture is the structure of your company. Now, when I talk about structure, I'm not just talking about the organizational structure, like the piece of paper that shows all the relationships. I mean, that's part of it. But the structure is all the policies and the processes that you put into place. Who you recruit, how you provide performance feedback, how you conduct daily operations, your vacation policies, what you teach during learning and development, who you promote, who you pay bonuses to, how you decide who gets a pay increment. All of these policies that you create tell employees what is really important. And again, you can hang posters on the wall, you can give them a hoodie that says we're innovative, but it's the policies you create that tell them what's really and truly important. So how do you create that culture? How do you shape that culture? First thing is to communicate the cultural factors that are important to your organization. I know that I say that what you do matters more than what you say. What you say is still a factor. The trick is just to make sure that they line up, okay? So you want to communicate what is important to your organization, then create structures that support that culture that you want now, that help you to create that culture now. And finally, you need to look for ways to sustain that culture in the future, because if you make changes now, you could lose all of it unless you've figured out a way to sustain it. So let's look at these three. And first of all, talk about communicating. You need to communicate what's really important to your organization. Now, first you need to communicate that to yourself. And I want you to be honest with yourself, okay? What do you really want this organization to be able to do? Or what do you want your team to be able to do? What do you think is really important? And then you need to be able to explain that to your employees. And by the way, I would also suggest explaining that to other external stakeholders, like candidates that you're considering hiring. Okay, let people know what's really important to your organization. Let me give you an example of this, an example of an organization I was in that did a communication exercise like this. So back in the mid-1990s, after the Cold War ended, I was in the United States Air Force, and the Air Force's mission and our operations changed dramatically because there was no Soviet Union anymore. And frankly, we were created to counter the Soviet Union. So we didn't really know what we were supposed to do. And we needed to communicate the changes. We needed to communicate the new expectations to our potential recruits. And our recruiting service realized, gosh, we need to communicate what we do. And somebody in the leadership realized, you know, we need to communicate that internally as well. So what they did was they hired a marketing agency to explain what the Air Force was all about to potential recruits and to the parents of potential recruits, so that they'd pat their kids on the back and say, go join the Air Force. But they also went further and used that recruiting campaign to explain the mission of the Air Force, the new mission of the Air Force, to the general public. And they took it a step further, and they created internal communications to explain the changes to current airmen, to people who are already in, because everything had changed, and everybody knew things had changed, but nobody knew quite how they had changed. They weren't sure what was important anymore. They weren't sure what the new rules of the game were. And so that's what part of this effort was all about. It was a way for the leadership to explain to people what was expected of them now. Rather than just trying to pass the word down through commanders and letting the message get muddled, it was one common message that went to everybody. Now, that's on a big scale. On a smaller scale, say with your team or with your division, you need to be able to communicate changes as they are coming along. And one of the things that I think is good to keep in mind is that when you're given direction, when you're told this is what the company is going to do, it helps if you don't come to your team and say, oh, this is what the big bosses say we have to do. Just come to them and say, this is what we need to do. Take ownership of that yourself. Take ownership of that part of the culture. Take ownership of those priorities and those values. It's not just we're doing this because the big bosses tell us to. It's we're doing this because this is what the company needs. As a boss, once you are given orders and you're turning around and ordering someone else what to do, those aren't someone else's orders anymore. They're yours. Okay, so you need to take ownership of them and work with your team in a way to help them understand that they're doing this because this is what's right and this is what's necessary, not just because this is what the senior VP told us to do. Okay, and we'll talk a bit more about that as we go on here. One thing I wanted to share, by the way, as we were trying to figure out how to explain the Air Force to everybody else, the recruiting agency kept coming up with different slogans and kept A/B testing a bunch of different slogans. And they went through a lot of them, and some of them worked and some of them not so much. My favorite of all time had to be the United States Air Force, don't make us come down there. To me, that just expressed everything we did. And unfortunately, I saw that in only one TV commercial, and then it went away, and I never saw it again. I thought it was a good message. But it's more than just sharing a message. Sharing that message is talking the talk. The actions you take, that's walking the walk. And that's what really matters. So once you've communicated to people what's important in the organization, you need to create a structure that actually supports what you just said. What you said is important in the organization. You don't want to say one thing and then do something else. So as you've figured out what's important to your whole company or just to your individual team, look for ways to reinforce that through the structure that you create. Your onboarding is a key example of this. The first impression somebody gets when they come in, when they're a new hire and they come to your company, is what they see through onboarding. And the way you onboard somebody helps them understand what's important. So for example, if collaboration is really important, and if working across functions and across different offices is important, then as a manager, when you have a new employee come in, one of the first things you can do to help them is already have appointments set for them to meet people that they should be networked with, that they should have relationships with. Not only does that help them actually start creating those relationships, but it reinforces the importance of those relationships in their daily work. If you just take somebody around the office and have them shake a bunch of hands in different cubicles and then that's it, that doesn't reinforce relationships. But you making the effort to put them in touch with those people and connect them with those people does reinforce that. That's a step you can take to emphasize the importance of collaboration. Think about the KPIs you set for people. If you want people to be innovative, then don't just set metrics around their ultimate success. Set some metrics for trying new ideas. Set some metrics for learning from failure. If you want people to learn from failure, require them to, share their failures maybe there's a quarterly lessons learned session. Share their successes and share their failures. Make that a requirement. Put it down on paper. Set it as a metric. The things you measure are the things people will do. Similarly, the things you reward and the things you recognize are the things people will do. So if you only recognize people for their ultimate success, then people are going to play it safe. And if you want an innovative company, you're not going to get that because people aren't going to take a chance. But if you start recognizing and rewarding people for taking a chance, even when it doesn't work, then you emphasize the value of innovation. There was an insurance company I used to work with in the United States that had a best failure of the quarter award, which I thought was awesome because it told people, look, failure is not a career killer. Failure is a way to move forward because it means you're trying something new and learning from it. So that's really, really cool. So think about the different policies that you can set, whether it's the day-to-day working policies like Google's 20% time, which says 20% of your time should be spent on something other than your regular work. That encourages innovation and collaboration and all of that. Think about the HR policies, the daily work policies, the dress code, the flexible work arrangements that you might have had 6 months ago and now everybody has. Think about how those can reinforce the qualities that you say that you want in your workspace. Consider also how to sustain this for the future. So first of all, as jobs change and as expectations change, you've got to go in and rewrite job descriptions. And job descriptions are such a valuable tool for telling people what's expected of them. Not only when they first come into the job, but when they are in their job and they need to look back and say, wait, I'm doing something outside my job description. So either I need to delegate this or my JD needs to change. It's a very useful tool for keeping track of what you should be doing. But if it never changes as the job changes, then you're losing the value of that tool. Consider how you recruit. Your job announcements, and again, going back to these JDs, need to accurately reflect what you expect in this job. Don't say that you're going to be focused on the customer when in fact you're just focused on driving as much revenue as humanly possible and you don't care if the customer can really use this, okay? Be honest in your job descriptions. If you're honest and transparent in your job descriptions, you're more likely to attract people who actually want to work that way, and you're going to get better employees who will then help you sustain this culture into the future. Think also about how you're developing your employees and how that affects the culture. Consider that if you want team players, you may need to build team building skills. If you want people to be innovative, send them to classes at the Design Thinking Academy or IDEO or others to learn other ways of thinking, okay? So target your development at supporting those cultural aspects that you think are so important, okay? So that's basically where I wanted us to go today. Those are our key points. And I'm gonna take questions again here in just a moment. There is one thing that I wanted to point out though, and that is that as you are going through all of this, remember I said this is valuable whether you're at the CEO level or at a team leader level. You can still make use of all of this on the appropriate scale. As a CEO, you might be changing the whole company. As a team leader, you might be trying to make sure your team is working well. So you want to understand the plans and the strategy that you're developing for your team, the way ahead for your team, but also understand the culture of your team. Now, realize that as you're trying to change that culture, you may get pushback. You may get people who don't want to participate in that, and that's not uncommon. The approach to take there that I would argue is to show how this is part of the bigger picture for the company, show how the company has changed, be willing to sit down and have that conversation with people. If they are resistant to change. Don't just tell people you got to do this or else. Have this conversation and try and win them over. Recognize that sometimes you can't. And I was talking with a client about this just a couple of weeks ago. They need something new from their employees and their employees don't want to do it. So really there are two good options here. Option one is that they're able to work with the employees and get them on board and adjust their expectations, adjust the culture. Or number two is those employees may need to go somewhere else. And that is okay. If this isn't the job they want to be in anymore, maybe that is where they need to move to. Maybe they need to move on. And you need to bring someone in who needs to work, who wants to work this way. So just something to keep in mind that you're likely to face some resistance as you're going through this whole process. Be open in your communication with folks. Be willing to listen to people's concerns. They're not voicing concerns just to be a problem. They're actually serious about it. And so it's worthwhile to listen to them. Now, with a session like this, it's common to be listening for 45 minutes and be thinking, oh, here's some things I'm going to do. But then when you get back to your inbox after this, you're kind of lost in that and you forget about what you were thinking about. So let me suggest, and we try to do this in every webinar, let me suggest some action items that you can take to take these ideas and go forward, some actual steps you can take. The first thing I would encourage you to do, if you don't already have an idea of what your recovery strategy is going to be from this pandemic, then you're already behind and you need to get started on it, okay? You need to start thinking about what comes next, either at the company level or at your team level, but you've got to be thinking about what comes next and how you're going to get back to profitability, how you're going to get back to success, how you're going to take advantage of any new opportunities that have come up. So you've got to get started drafting that. And if you haven't, then I encourage you to do so. While you're doing that, parallel with that, I would suggest that you try to describe and articulate your organizational culture. Figure out what your culture really is, what today's culture really is. And remember, like I said at the beginning, it may be different than it was 6 months ago because everybody's working so much differently right now. Once you've done that, compare the two, compare your draft of a strategy with your culture, figure out if it's a viable strategy, or if there are gaps, see if you can overcome those gaps. Can you overcome them by adjusting your strategy? Or are there some cultural factors that you may need to change? And if so, if there are cultural factors that you need to change, what are some policy changes you can make that would help you with that? Okay. So with that in mind, I know I'm bumping up against our 45 minutes here. For those of you who can stay with us a little bit longer, I encourage you to. I'd like to take any questions from you that you might have. Again, you can type those in the chat box. I've got a couple that have come into me privately that I'll go ahead and touch on here. I'd also like to point out I've got our website listed there. So if you'd like to learn more about the programs we offer, we do individual coaching as well as seminars and workshops. If you're looking ahead, like say to the beginning of the year, you've got some town halls or some all hands meetings coming up as you get into the next calendar year and you're looking for a keynote speaker, we do offer some keynotes and we'd be happy to talk to you about that. I'm going to ask my colleague Jason to put our link, a linkable link there in the chat box, if he could, just to let everybody know if you want to click on that and visit our website. We encourage you to do that. And if you want to reach out to me directly, let's see. Here's my LinkedIn. Feel free to connect with me if you're not already. Also, you can respond to any of the emails that you've gotten about this webinar. Those will get back to us as well. So please do reach out to us as you have any follow-on questions, or if you're curious about any of the programs we offer that we'll try to help you with all of this. Now, if I can, I've gotten a couple of questions privately, and if it's okay, let me touch on those. Let me try and address those real quickly. If you can stay with us a few more minutes, please do. Now, somebody has asked about multinationals and large regional organizations, that organizational change and supporting the evolution of culture may be difficult for these large organizations. Perhaps you can discuss the role of fostering change at the micro level within teams or divisions. That is very important. And let me tell you, and again, going back to my PhD work, I studied the organizational change in the Air Force. One of the big problems that we had in the Air Force with changing our organizational culture in the 1990s was that we got the message from the big bosses, like I told you earlier, that whole, don't make us come down there and all that, that all came out, that was fine. When it came to the structural changes though, that fell apart because at the micro level, those changes didn't happen. We promoted people for being the best, fighter pilot in air-to-air combat, even though we didn't really do a whole lot of air-to-air combat anymore. Meanwhile, we were doing a lot of support to the Army, but we weren't advocating for that. We weren't promoting people for doing well at that. We weren't teaching people how to do that better. So a lot of the structures fell apart at the team level. It's absolutely essential, I think, for a large organization's change to come from the micro level, because it can fall apart there. It can absolutely fall apart there. So this is where, as a team leader or as a division chief or as the head of a business unit, anywhere from a first-time manager to somebody who's like leading a country team, you need to be really aware of what the larger organization needs from your people, because that needs to be the basis of your culture. And then you first need to communicate that, but then you need to hold people accountable for following through on that. You need to hold people accountable for following through on that. And that's what we didn't see in the military, which was a big problem. It was a huge problem. And call me sometime and we'll have that conversation, okay? I think accountability is what was lacking there. So as you are trying to create changes in the way people work, you need to hold people accountable for those changes. And that's just as true whether you're the country president or managing a 3-person team. If you need people to change, you need to hold them accountable for that change, okay? And try and do it, I would argue, again, going back to the point I made earlier, trying to do it in a non-threatening way, trying to be open about why these changes are coming, be willing to communicate the reasons for changes. I think that's very valuable, and people will buy in a lot better if they get that kind of communication. Again, in the military, we were used to telling people, do it this way, don't ask me any questions, and that's not helpful. And I know that for a lot of organizations, that's actually the traditional hierarchical style. The boss talks and everybody else just listens. But you need to listen, boss man, boss woman. You need to be listening, okay, to your people. It's really important, and you need to be willing to explain why you're doing what you're doing. So another question that we've got here, are you seeing organizations preparing for a strategy and culture shift post COVID-19? And if yes, what are the shifts? Unfortunately, I would say in most cases, no, I'm not seeing the changes. I'm not seeing companies get ready for that. And in most of the conversations that I'm having, I think folks have been so wrapped up in getting used to the way they're working now and changing to this, that they haven't been given a lot of thought going forward, as to what comes next. Now, this is a point that keeps coming up in my coaching conversations, in my individual one-on-one coaching with people. We're trying to get that started. Okay, we're trying to get that started. And one of the challenges they're having is people are still a bit confused about their day-to-day work. I would say that by this point, depending on where you live, 4 or 5 months into this working from home experiment, we've probably gotten pretty used to doing things the way we're going to do them right now. But the time is now to be looking ahead. So one of the questions we were asking was, what is your plan for going back to the office? Is there a plan for going back to the office? Are you going to go back to the office? Companies need to be figuring this out, because landlords are going to keep collecting payments. And if you're not planning to go back to the office, you might as well try to stop that payment as quickly as you can. But until you've come up with a plan, you don't know what you should be doing. So I'm not seeing too many shifts. There are a couple shifts that I'm seeing, but mostly those are at companies that have been taking advantage of the opportunities here. Companies like Zoom and Netflix have certainly been changing their future strategy to take advantage of the opportunities presented by people being at home and working from home and so forth. But in the case of Netflix, for example, they've also recognized the challenges. They have trouble producing new stuff now because production is shut down. So, their strategy was going towards new original programming, and they're having to shift back a little bit to old films, old movies, old TV shows. And you're probably seeing a lot more new movies coming up on Netflix now. And I think it's because of that, because their strategy is shifting due to the challenges presented by COVID. We are seeing the movie industry change because they're not releasing movies into theaters now. So they're releasing them on streaming, they're releasing them as video on demand, and that's causing them to rethink their future strategies. If they don't need to be doing something now, then do they really need to do it in the future? One pharmaceutical company that I'm working with is reevaluating their sales force, because their salespeople haven't been making in-person sales calls, and yet doctors are still buying and using their drugs. So when things go back to normal, do they really need to go back to making in-person sales calls? So people are starting to ask the questions, but they're not really coming up with the answers yet. And I'm encouraging people to start coming up with the answers a little more quickly, because this is, the time is now. And if you're not doing it yet, you are behind. Yeah, so I hope that answers your question. Short question, long answer, I realize. But I'm not seeing a whole lot of changes yet, but I encourage people to get on that. So, okay. All right, well, thank you very much. Are there any other last questions? I know we're about 10 minutes over our time, but are there any other last questions before we close this out? And nothing in the chat box, nobody up on the microphone. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for joining our session today. We do these every month. We do them the last Thursday of the month. So I encourage you to go ahead and join us. If you have any requests, by the way, for topics, please go ahead and email them to me. Let me know what you're thinking about. Let me know what your concerns are, and we'll see if we can't turn that into a webinar topic. And if we select your topic, we'll send you a prize. I won't tell you what the prize is because I hadn't thought about that until just this moment. But we'll send you a prize. So we look forward to seeing you again in a future session. Good luck to all of you, and please reach out to us with any questions or any follow-ons that you might have. Thanks again, and enjoy the rest of your day.